For decades, American presidents have faced the same difficult question when it comes to Iran. Do you try to change the regime, or do you negotiate with it? According to political analyst Fareed Zakaria, that contradiction may be at the heart of America's Iran policy problem. In this clip, Fareed argues that President Trump is facing the exact same dilemma that previous administrations struggled with. On one hand, there is pressure to take a hard line against Iran. On the other hand, if the goal is stability and limits on Iran's nuclear program, negotiations may be unavoidable. Let's watch the clip and then break down the argument in more detail.
Here's my take. Why is the most powerful country on the planet unable to get its way with a much smaller, weaker country that has been ravaged by economic sanctions and military strikes? At one level, the simplest way to understand America's problem in the Iran war is to use game theory. Donald Trump decided to play a game of chicken with Iran. Think of two drivers racing straight at each other. In these situations, if the stakes for one side are existential and for the other much lower, the side with those bigger stakes usually prevails. For the Iranian regime, if they lose, there's a good chance they end up toppled and slaughtered. For Trump, it would be a bad weekend at Mar-a-Lago. It's easy to see why the Iranians would be more willing to lock their steering wheel in that game of chicken. But there's a broader reason why America has found it so difficult to handle Iran, one that is not just about Trump and this latest ill-conceived war. Ever since the Islamic regime took power in Iran, America has been of two minds about it. On the one hand, the U.S. has had certain issues it wanted resolved, from the return of the hostages to nuclear limits. On the other hand, it wants to topple the regime, not just negotiate with it. There is a tension in these two attitudes that has run through American foreign policy for almost half a century. Does Washington want to change certain policies of Iran, or does it want to change Iran? If Washington negotiates with Tehran, inevitably there is give and take. There are concessions on both sides. There is some relaxation of hostilities. Above all, in engaging with it, the United States government is conferring a certain degree of legitimacy on the Islamic Republic, treating it as a serious negotiating partner, accepting that it represents Iran on the world stage. But that acceptance sits uneasily with some American elites who feel that the Islamic Republic is illegitimate, should not exist, and Washington's only policy toward it should be to overthrow it. And yet there are things Washington wants that only Iran can deliver. That is why even Ronald Reagan found himself secretly negotiating with the Iranian mullahs while publicly denouncing them. We can see the tension almost daily in Donald Trump's policy toward Iran. One social media post threatens to destroy Iranian civilization and bring an end to 47 years of evil. Another one that same day speaks of the progress being made in negotiations with Iran. Trump enters negotiations and seems optimistic about a deal with Iran, and in between rounds starts a war with Tehran and urges Iranians to overthrow their government. Less than a week later, he's back to promising that if they agree to his demands, Iran will have a very bright future. America had a similarly contradictory attitude toward the Soviet Union. After the communists took control of Russia in 1917, Washington broke relations with it and even tried in some small ways to overthrow it. It took Franklin Delano Roosevelt about 15 years later to recognize its existence and exchange ambassadors with Moscow. The tension reemerged after World War II. In the 1970s, Henry Kissinger's policy of negotiation with the Soviet Union was pilloried on the right because it was seen as bolstering the standing of an evil empire. Kissinger's response was always that America stood in ideological opposition to the Soviet Union, but that it also had certain national interests, like the control of nuclear weapons, which could not be handled without agreements with Moscow. Kissinger's equivalent in the Iran debate was Barack Obama. Obama's was the one administration to make a choice. It determined that while America might prefer another regime in Iran, it had to deal with this one to tackle the greatest danger to America's national interest, which, as with the Soviet case, involved nuclear weapons. The Iran nuclear deal was an effort to take the one most dangerous element of Iran's foreign policy and neutralize it. And it succeeded at that. But for many on the right, the price was that it, in some sense, legitimized the regime. So Trump pulled the US out of the deal, which then led to the discrediting of then Iranian President Hassan Rouhani and the return of the hardliners in Tehran, who ramped up Iran's enrichment program, which has brought Donald Trump right back to the same dilemma. Does he make a deal or take a stand? At this point, it's clear that Trump wants a deal. But in making it, he might end up giving the Islamic Republic what it has been seeking for 47 years: unqualified acceptance, even from the most hardline elements of the United States. For Tehran, that is a prize worth many concessions.
The ball is in the US court because of the fact there is no much room in the Iranian eyes for compromises. Now, they're demanding lifting of the naval blockade. They want to negotiate first and foremost the condition to end the war, and only then to negotiate on the nuclear issue. And it goes straight to your column, saying that the US administration need to decide whether he wants to topple this regime, and then you have to return back to war, a serious war, lengthy war, or you want to compromise with the regime, but then he has to show compromises in a way that he has to accept some of the Iranian demands.
The central argument Fareed makes is actually quite simple. The United States appears to want two things at the same time. It wants Iran to change its behavior, but many policymakers also want the Iranian regime itself weakened or replaced. According to Fareed, those goals can sometimes conflict with each other. Negotiating with a government gives that government legitimacy. Yet if the United States refuses to negotiate, it becomes much harder to reach agreements on issues like nuclear enrichment, sanctions, or regional security. He also points to history. During the Cold War, American leaders strongly opposed the Soviet Union ideologically, but still negotiated on issues such as nuclear weapons because both sides had interests that could not be ignored. Critics of this view would argue that negotiating with Iran risks rewarding a government that many Western leaders consider hostile and untrustworthy. Supporters would counter that diplomacy is not about friendship. It is about protecting national interests and avoiding larger conflicts. That is really the question at the center of this debate. Is diplomacy a form of weakness, or is it simply a recognition of political reality? And that brings us to the bigger question. Beyond the headlines and political arguments, what does this actually mean for the future of US-Iran relations? The bigger issue here is not whether viewers agree with Fareed Zakaria. The bigger issue is whether the United States can realistically achieve all of its goals at the same time. If Washington wants strict limits on Iran's nuclear activities, it may have to make compromises. If it wants maximum pressure and regime change, that creates a very different path, one that could involve greater instability and the risk of a longer conflict. What's interesting is that this debate is not new. Similar arguments have existed across multiple administrations, from Ronald Reagan to Barack Obama, and now Donald Trump. Different presidents have chosen different strategies, but the underlying dilemma has remained remarkably consistent. As this situation develops, the key question will be whether both sides believe they can gain more through negotiation than through confrontation. History suggests that when neither side is willing to compromise, tensions tend to escalate rather than disappear. But what do you think? Do you believe diplomacy with Iran strengthens stability, or does it risk giving too much legitimacy to the regime? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy political analysis, foreign policy discussions, and breaking news coverage, don't forget to subscribe to Signal Westminster for more coverage of the biggest stories shaping Britain, America, and the wider world. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.